The Gentleman from Indiana by Booth Tarkington. Read in English for the 10th First Chapter Collection. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Chapter 1. The Young Man Who Came to Stay. There is a fertile stretch of flatlands in Indiana where unagrarian Eastern travelers, glancing from car windows, shudder and return their eyes to interior upholstery, preferring even the swaying caparisons of a Pullman to the monotony without. The landscape lies interminably level, bleak in winter, a desolate plain of mud and snow, hot and dusty in summer, in its flat lonesomeness, miles on miles with not one cool hill slope away from the sun. The persistent tourist who seeks for signs of man in this sad expanse perceives a reckless amount of rail fence, at intervals a large barn, and here and there man himself, incurious, patient, slow, looking up from the fields apathetically as the limited flies by. Widely separated from each other are small frame railway stations, sometimes with no other building in sight, which indicates that somewhere behind the adjacent woods a few shanties and thin cottages are grouped about a couple of brick stores. On the station platforms there are always 2 or 3 wooden packing boxes, apparently marked for travel, but they are sacred from disturbance and remain on the platform forever. Possibly the right train never comes along. They serve to enthrone a few station loafers, who look out from under their hat brims at the faces in the car windows with the languid scorn a permanent fixture always has for a transient, and the pity an American feels for a fellow being who does not live in his town. Now and then the train passes a town built scatteringly about a courthouse, with a mill or two humming near the tracks. This is a county seat, and the inhabitants in the local papers refer to it confidently as our city. The heart of the flat lands is a central area called Carlow County, and the county seat of Carlow is a town unhappily named in honor of its first settler, William Platt, who cherished it with his blood. Natives of this place have sometimes remarked easily that their city had a population of from 5,000 to 6,000 souls. It is easy to forgive them for such statements. Civic pride is a virtue. The social and business energy of Plattville concentrates on the square. Here in summertime the gentlemen are wont to lounge from store to store in their shirt-sleeves, and here stood the old red-brick courthouse, loosely fenced in a shady grove of maple and elm. Slippery Elm, called the courthouse yard. When the sun grew too hot for the dry goods box whittlers in front of the stores around the square, and the occupants of the chairs in front of the Palace Hotel on the corner, they would go across and drape themselves over the courthouse fence, under the trees, and leisurely carve their initials on the top board. The farmers hitched their teams to the fence, for there were usually loafers energetic enough to shout "Whoa!" if the flies worried the horses beyond patience. In the yard, amongst the weeds and tall, unkempt grass, chickens foraged all day long. The fence was so low that the most matronly hen flew over with propriety, and there were gaps that accommodated the passage of itinerant pigs. Most of the latter, however, preferred the cool wallows of the less important street corners. Here and there a big dog lay asleep in the middle of the road, knowing well that the easy-going Samaritan, in his case, would pass by on the other side. Only one street attained to the dignity of a name, Main Street, which formed the north side of the square. In Carlow County, descriptive location is usually accomplished by designating the adjacent as up at Bardlock's, down by Showfields, right where Hibbards live, across from Sol Tibbs, or other side of Jones's Field. In winter, Main Street was a series of frozen gorges and land hummocks. In fall and spring, a river of mud. In summer, a continuing dust heap. It was the best street in Plattville. The people lived happily, and while the world whirled on outside, they were content with their own. It would have moved their surprise as much as their indignation to hear themselves spoken of as a secluded community. For they sat up all night to hear the vote of New York, every campaign. Once, when the president visited Rowan, 70 miles away, there were only a few bankrupts, and not a baby amongst them, left in the deserted homes of Carlow County. Everybody had adventures, almost everybody saw the great man, and everybody was glad to get back home again. It was the longest journey some of them ever set upon, and these, elated as they were over their travels, determined to think twice ere they went that far from home another time. On Saturdays, the farmers enlivened the commercial atmosphere of Platteville, and Miss Tibbs, the postmaster's sister and clerk, used to make a point of walking up and down Main Street as often as possible, to get a thrill in the realization of some poetical expressions that haunted her pleasingly, phrases she had employed frequently in her poems for the Carlow County Herald. When 30 or 40 country people were scattered along the sidewalks in front of the stores on Main Street, she would walk at nicely calculated angles to the different groups, so as to leave as few gaps as possible between the figures, making them appear as near a solid phalanx as she could. Then she would murmur to herself, with the accent of soulful revel, the thronged city streets, and within the thronged city, or where the thronging crowds were swarming and the great cathedral rose. Although she had never been beyond Carlow and the bordering counties in her life, all her poems were of city streets and bustling multitudes. She was one of those who had been unable to join the excursion to Rowan when the president was there, but she had listened avidly to her friend's descriptions of the crowds. Before that time her muse had been sylvan, speaking of flowers of May, and hinting at thoughts that overcame her when she roved the woodlands through. But now the inspiration was become decidedly municipal and urban, evidently reluctant to depart beyond the retail portions of a metropolis. Her verses beginning, "O my native city, bride of Hibbard's winding stream," Hibbard's Creek runs west of Platteville, except in time of drought, "when thy myriad lights are shining, and thy faces, like a dream, go flitting down thy sidewalks when their daily toil is done," were pronounced at the time of their publication the best poem that had ever appeared in the Herald. This unlucky newspaper was a thorn in the side of every patriot of Carlow County. It was a poor paper. Everybody knew it was a poor paper. It was so poor that everybody admitted it was a poor paper. Worse, the neighboring county of Amo possessed a better paper, the Amo Gazette. The Carlow County Herald was so everlastingly bad that Platteville people bent their heads bitterly, and admitted even to citizens of Amo that the Gazette was the better paper. The Herald was a weekly, issued on Saturday. Sometimes it hung fire over Sunday and appeared Monday evening. In their pride, the Carlow people supported the Herald loyally and long. But finally subscriptions began to fall off, and the Gazette gained them. It came to pass that the Herald missed fire altogether for several weeks. Then it came out feebly, 2 small advertisements occupying the whole of the 4th page. It was breathing its last. The editor was a clay-colored gentleman with a goatee, whose one surreptitious eye betokened both indolence of disposition and a certain furtive shrewdness. He collected all the outstanding subscriptions he could on the morning of the issue just mentioned, and, thoughtfully neglecting several items on the other side of the ledger, departed from Platteville forever. The same afternoon a young man from the east alighted on the platform of the railway station north of the town, and entering the rickety omnibus that lingered there, seeking whom it might rattle to deafness, demanded to be driven to the Herald building. It did not strike the driver that the newcomer was precisely a gay young man when he climbed into the omnibus, but an hour later, as he stood in the doorway of the edifice he had indicated as his destination, depression seemed to have settled into the marrow of his bones. Platteville was instantly alert to the stranger's presence, and interesting conjectures were hazarded all day long at the back door of Martin's Dry Goods Emporium, where all the clerks from the stores around the square came to play checkers or look on at the game. This was the club during the day. In the evening, the club and the game removed to the drug, book, and wallpaper store on the corner. At supper, The new arrival and his probable purposes were discussed over every table in the town. Upon inquiry, he had informed Judd Bennett, the driver of the omnibus, that he had come to stay. Naturally, such a declaration caused a sensation, as people did not come to Platteville to live, except through the inadvertency of being born there. In addition, the young man's appearance and attire were reported to be extraordinary. Many of the curious, among them most of the marriageable females of the place, took occasion to pass and repass the sign of the Carlow County Herald during the evening. Meanwhile, the stranger was seated in the dingy office upstairs with his head bowed low on his arms. Twilight stole through the dirty window panes and faded into darkness. Night filled the room. He did not move. The young man from the East had bought the Herald from an agent, had bought it without ever having been within 100 miles of Platteville. He had vastly overpaid for it. Moreover, the price he had paid for it was all the money he had in the world. The next morning he went bitterly to work. He hired a compositor from Rowan, a young man named Parker, who sat type all night long and helped him pursue advertisements all day. The citizens shook their heads pessimistically. They had about given up the idea that the Herald could ever amount to anything, and they betrayed an innocent but caustic doubt of ability in any stranger. One day the new editor left a note on his door. "Will return in 15 minutes. Mr. Rodney McCune, a politician from the neighboring county of Gaines, happening to be in Platteville on an errand to his henchman, found the note and wrote beneath the message the scathing inquiry, 'Why?' When he discovered this addendum, the editor smiled for the first time since his advent, and reported the incident in his next issue, using the rubric, 'Why has the Herald returned to life?' as a text for a rousing editorial on honesty in politics, a subject of which he already knew something. The political district to which Carlow belonged was governed by a limited number of gentlemen whose wealth was ever on the increase, and honesty in politics was a startling conception to the minds of the passive and resigned voters, who discussed the editorial on the street corners and in the stores. The next week there was another editorial, personal and local in its application, and thereby it became evident that the new proprietor of the Herald was a theorist who believed, in general, that a politician's honor should not be merely of that middling healthy species known as honor amongst politicians, and in particular that Rodney McCune should not receive the nomination of his party for Congress. Now, Mr. McCune was the undoubted dictator of the district, and his followers laughed at the stranger's fantastic onset. But the editor was not content with a word of print. He hired a horse and rode about the county, and, to his own surprise, he proved to be an adaptable young man who enjoyed exercise with a pitchfork to the farmer's profit while the farmer talked. He talked little himself, but after listening an hour or so, he would drop a word from the saddle as he left, and then, by some surprising wizardry, the farmer, thinking over the interview, decided that there was some sense in what that young fellow said, and grew curious to see what the young fellow had further to say in the Herald. Politics is the one subject that goes to the vitals of every rural American, and a Hoosier will talk politics after he is dead. Everybody read the campaign editorials and found them interesting, although there was no one who did not perceive the utter absurdity of a young stranger's dropping into Carlow and involving himself in a party fight against the boss of the district. It was entirely a party fight, for by grace of the last gerrymander, the nomination carried with it the certainty of election. A week before the convention there came a provincial earthquake. The news passed from man to man in awe-struck whispers. McCune had withdrawn his name, making the hollowest of excuses to his cohorts. Nothing was known of the real reason for his disordered retreat, beyond the fact that he had been in Platteville on the morning before his withdrawal, and had issued from a visit to the Herald office in a state of palsy. Mr. Parker, the Rowan printer, had been present at the close of the interview, but he held his peace at the command of his employer. He had been called into the sanctum, and had found McCune, white and shaking, leaning on the desk. "Parker," said the editor, exhibiting a bundle of papers he held in his hand, "I want you to witness a verbal contract between Mr. McCune and myself. These papers are an affidavit, and copies of some records of a streetcar company which obtained a charter while Mr. McCune was in the state legislature. They were sent to me by a man I do not know, an anonymous friend of Mr. McCune's, in fact, a friend he seems to have lost. On consideration of our not printing these papers, Mr. McCune agrees to retire from politics for good. You understand, if he ever lifts his head again, politically, we publish them, and the courts will do the rest. Now, in any case anything should happen to me, something will happen to you, all right, broke out McCune. You can bank on that, you black— Come, the editor interrupted, not unpleasantly. Why should there be anything personal in all this? I don't recognize you as my private enemy, not at all. And I think you are getting off rather easily, aren't you? You stay out of politics and everything will be comfortable. You ought never to have been in it, you see. It's a mistake not to keep square, because in the long run somebody is sure to give you away, like the fellow who sent me these. You promise to hold to a strictly private life? You're a traitor to the party, groaned the other. But you only wait. The editor smiled sadly. Wait nothing. Don't threaten, man. Go home to your wife. I'll give you 3 to 1 she'll be glad you're out of it. I'll give you 3 to 1, said McCune, that the Whitecaps will get you if you stay in Carlo. You want to look out for yourself, I tell you, my smart boy. Good day, Mr. McCune, was the answer. Let me have your note of withdrawal before you leave town this afternoon. The young man paused a moment, then extended his hand, as he said, Shake hands, won't you? I haven't meant to be too hard on you. I hope things will seem easier and gayer to you before long. And if anything should turn up that I can do for you in a private way, I'll be very glad, you know. Goodbye. The sound of the herald's victory went over the state. The paper came out regularly. The townsfolk bought it, and the farmers drove in for it. Old subscribers came back. Old advertisers renewed. The Herald began to sell in ammo, and Gaines County people subscribed. Carlo folk held up their heads when journalism was mentioned. Presently the Herald announced a news connection with Rowan, and with that, and the aid of patent insides, began an era of 3 issues a week, appearing on Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays. The Platteville brass band serenaded the editor. During the second month of the new regime of the Herald, the working force of the paper received an addition. One night the editor found some barroom loafers tormenting a patriarchal old man who had a magnificent head and a grand white beard. He had been thrown out of a saloon, and he was drunk with the drunkenness of 3 weeks' steady pouring. He propped himself against a wall and reproved his tormentors in Latin. I'm walking your way, Mr. Fisby, remarked the journalist, hooking his arm into the old man's. Suppose we leave our friends here and go home. Mr. Fisby was the one inhabitant of the town who had an unknown past. No one knew more about him than that he had been connected with a university somewhere, and had traveled in unheard-of countries before he came to Platteville. The glamour of romance was thrown about him by the gossips, to which he ever proved a fund of delightful speculation. There was a dark, portentous secret in his life, it was agreed, an opinion not too well confirmed by the old man's appearance. His fine eyes had a pathetic habit of wandering to the horizon in a questioning fashion that had a queer sort of hopelessness in it, as if his quest were one for the Holy Grail, perhaps, and his expression was mild, vague, and sad. He had a look of race and blood, and yet at the first glance one saw that he was lost in dreams, and one guessed that the dreams would never be of great practicability in their application. Some such impression of Fisby was probably what caused the editor of the Herald to nickname him, in his own mind, the White Knight, and to conceive a strong if whimsical fancy for him. Old Fisby had come, from nobody knew where, to Platteville to teach, and had been principal of the high school for 10 years, instructing his pupils after a peculiar fashion of his own, neglecting the ordinary courses of high school instruction to lecture on archaeology to the dumbfounded scholars. Growing year by year more forgetful and absent, lost in his few books and his own reflections, until, though undeniably a scholar, he had been discharged for incompetency. He was old, he had no money and no way to make money, he could find nothing to do. The blow had seemed to daze him for a time, then he began to drop in at the hotel bar, where Wilkerson, the professional drunkard, favored him with his society. The old man understood. He knew it was the beginning of the end. He sold his books in order to continue his credit at the palace bar, and once or twice, unable to proceed to his own dwelling, spent the night in a lumber yard, piloted thither by the hardier veteran, Wilkerson.